This video is going to focus on how to multiply complex numbers. Now, what you see in front of you is not complex numbers, these are just regular real numbers. But if you remember how to distribute two sets of parentheses to multiply them together, you already know the basics of how to multiply complex numbers. It's going to be very similar to that, with one very important addition. You need to remember that when you have an I term being multiplied by another I term, well, I times I is the same thing as -1. Meaning, let's say we have 2I times 2I. Your answer is going to be 2 times 2, which is 4, but then I times I makes it negative, so it's going to be a -4. That is going to be one of the key differences that you're going to need to pay attention to when we are attempting to multiply and distribute with our imaginary numbers. With that said, let's get to it. To begin, when you are multiplying imaginary numbers, sometimes you might start off with a problem that looks like this, where you have the square root of -7 times the square root of -2. Our best choice when encountering a problem like this is to first change them into imaginary numbers instead of just having them as the square root of negative numbers. So we can change the square root of -7 into I times the square root of +7, and we can change the square root of -2 into I times the square root of 2. Now we can do some multiplication. First of all, we want to multiply our square roots. If I have the square root of 7 times the square root of 2, all I need to do is to draw my square root symbol and multiply the 7 and the 2. 7 and the 2, or 7 times 2 is 14. Now I have to deal with my I terms. We already said before we tried this problem that I times I equals -1. So if I'm multiplying I times I to go along with this, I have -1 times the square root of 14. Or we could just write this as the negative square root of 14. And that is your answer. If you can reduce what's underneath the radical, you need to do that. But with 14, we cannot take out any perfect squares, so we can't reduce our radicals. Let's try one more like this. Alright, once again, we have square root problems with negative numbers underneath. So just like before, we want to take out the negative and put the I in front of the radical. So the square root of -8 becomes I times the square root of 8. And the square root of -3 becomes I times the square root of 3. Now, just like before, start off by drawing your radical. Multiply 8 times 3, which is 24. And then remember that I times I is -1, so our answer is the negative square root of 24. But we can't leave it like this, because 24 has a perfect square in it that we can take out. So 24 can get broken down into the square root of 4 times the square root of 6, which becomes 2 times the square root of 6. And since the square root was negative before, our answer is the -2 times the square root of 6. And we are all done. It's got some rules with it that we have to remember, but all in all, it's nothing too terrible. Now, let's try multiplying when we have numbers that are already in the complex form. In this example, we are working our way up to multiplying two problems that are in the basic complex number format. Starting off, though, we're just going to multiply this quantity by 3i. And we do this by distributing the 3i to each term on the inside. Okay, just like when we were multiplying with variables. So we have 3i times 4. All we're going to do here is multiply the 3 with the 4, so that's 12. And don't forget the I that came along with it, plus Alright, here we've got 3 times 5, which is 15. But then we also have I times I. Don't forget, I times I is negative 1. So this is actually not just going to be 15, it's going to be 15 times negative 1, or 12I minus 15. And if you really want to put it into the general format, we have to switch the numbers around, so our final answer is negative 15 plus 12I. And there we have multiplied a quantity by an imaginary number. Now, let's see what happens when we have two quantities that are multiplying each other. For our last example, we finally worked our way up to two imaginary quantities being multiplied with each other. And as I said at the beginning, if you remember how to do your FOIL method or your double distribution, this shouldn't be too much of a problem as long as you remember how to handle those i's. So, we want to make sure that we first multiply the first terms, then the outer terms, then we can multiply the inner terms, and then the last terms. So, let's begin. I'm going to start off with 2 times 3, which is just 6. Plus, now I've got 2 times 4i. We're just going to multiply the 2 and the 4, which will give us 8. And since the 2 does not have an imaginary term with it, the I just gets brought along, so I have 8I. I'm halfway done now. Now, I need to start multiplying with my negative because of the subtraction sign here, my negative 6I times 3. Well, negative 6 times 3 is negative 18, so minus 18. And since this has an I and this doesn't, we're just going to put the I back on. And now lastly, I have negative 6I times 4I. Both terms have integers and imaginary terms, so we're going to have to do a little bit of work for this one, but that's alright. So I've got negative 6 times positive 4, which is going to be negative 24. But then I also have, once again, my I times I. And just for old time's sake, I times I equals negative 1. So really I have my negative 24 at the end times a negative 1. Well, what is negative 24 times negative 1? It is positive 24. So, instead of rewriting the whole thing, I'm just going to erase this, and since it's positive now, I'm going to make it a plus sign. The last thing we have to do is combine our like terms. I've got a 6, and I've got a positive 24, so this is going to change into 30, and then I have an 8i minus 18i. 8 minus 18 is negative 10, and then the i's come along with it, so I have 30 minus 10i, and that is my final answer. Hope you found this tutorial on multiplying complex numbers useful, and good luck.